Hey everyone, happy Saturday. Welcome back to the podcast, If I Were the Devil, the War on Love. I have been alluding to on several episodes now that I'm going to need to talk about trauma. And I had planned to cover the heart because we are going to be having multiple episodes on the heart. And as I was getting ready to go into that series, I thought, let me actually go ahead and talk about trauma now because you need to understand trauma. So let's start off with a reminder of why we're here. The greatest commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That is the first and greatest commandment from Matthew 22:37-38. If I were the devil and I hated God, I would do whatever I could to keep them from knowing God, trusting God, and I would use shame and isolation to do this. As soon as a person sins, they will feel bad. And that is because God wants his children to live free, not in captivity of sin. His commandments are to keep them safe and close to him away from shame. Ha ha. All I need to do is get them to sin and convince them that they are now alone and they will be afraid. They will hide and isolate. I will use other humans to hurt others. And since I have had a lifetime of studying humans and brains and hearts, I know how trauma works. I know how to twist the words of others, how to leverage pride, self-centeredness, and those with hardened hearts who will never take personal responsibility. Children will learn lies very early that the adults' issues are their issues. Sins of others can do as much damage as those who sin themselves. And Christians, I just need them to be unwilling to ask for help, which is not that hard since I have spread a message of false pride. And through deception and false teachings, I have used wounded people in church to wound people. No talk of feelings is allowed, and some will believe that emotional needs are weak and means that they don't have faith. If they only knew how much I am in the church doors too. Welcome to the podcast. So I'm going to tell you in advance, this is going to be long. This is going to be heavy. This is going to be hard. This is not a light topic. And my guess is that you have trauma. Again, you don't even realize that you have trauma because you think it's something that it's not. My guess is you have probably thought or said out loud, I'm not traumatized. Nothing bad has ever happened to me. I just need to move on. Why can't I feel close to God? I know about him, but I want to feel him and I can't. I don't know why I keep pushing people away. And today we're going to be talking about that why and how it's highly likely that trauma is at the root. If you're having trouble in your relationships, if you're having trouble with anxiety, if you're having trouble with feeling it's challenging for you to be around other people and to be yourself, all these and more are likely secondary to trauma. I'm also going to be showing you where trauma shows up in the books of the Bible. Throughout, there's a lot of examples of trauma in the Bible, but I'm going to be covering the life of Job, David, and Joseph specifically. And Job in particular, I often refer to some of my seasons like Job experiences. But in Job, there's just a very detailed portrait of trauma. It actually maps out how we would recognize it as a physiological symptom of trauma. In Job 7:5, 30:17, and 30:30, he actually had skin lesions and sleeplessness. He was wasting away and had bodily pain. Those are actually symptoms of trauma. His nervous system was obviously dysregulated. He described his body as being in constant torment, which is pretty much when someone is having like somatic, which is the body, having problems in their body. And the medical community is like, I don't know. Eventually they came out with fibromyalgia, which is essentially, it's unexplained. They don't know why someone has fibromyalgia. And I can tell you why. It is most likely from trauma. Hyperarousal and sleep disturbances show up repeatedly in Job, and he is terrified by dreams and visions and nightmares that disturb him, and he finds no rest. That's in Job 7:13-14. And that really just mirrors the hypervigilance and intrusive sleep disruption that is common to PTSD. Intrusive thoughts and ruminations are central to the entire narrative of Job. He can't stop thinking about his suffering. That's all he's thinking about day in and day out. He's rehearsing it. He's questioning it. He keeps circling back obsessively. And that is what we call the intrusive and re-experiencing cycle of trauma. That looks different depending on what the trauma is. In my work with women who have experienced intimate betrayal, that continuing to want to go back over discovery, D-Day, continuing to go back over, wait, he said this, he said that. Where were we this particular year, where when this was going on? And so that intrusive thought, those obsessions, and being able to get out of that thought loop, we call it, that are symptoms of trauma. Grief, despair, and depression are obvious in the story of Job. He curses the day he was born, Job 3:3. I don't know if you guys listening have ever been there, but I absolutely have been in the pit of despair more times than I could count. But he expresses a wish to die. He feels his life is without value. He experiences hopelessness. And that is consistent with depression that comes with trauma and grief also. And by the way, with trauma, there's always going to be grief that comes in tandem with trauma. Anger and protest are throughout the book of Job. His laments are raw and confrontational. They're directed at God, at his circumstances. And people who survive trauma, they'll oftentimes oscillate between feeling despair and anger. And Job just does this openly. Sometimes people are in isolation because they feel embarrassed about it, or they feel like no one would understand, or a lot of times people get shamed. Unfortunately, in the church, this happens where people feel like they can't be themselves and have their struggles because they, quote, should just have more faith. Shame and social isolation also compound Job's suffering. He loses his social standing. He's abandoned and mocked by his peers who once respected him. That is oftentimes what happens, whether it's perception or reality. This happens to people who have experienced trauma. This absolutely shows up in the betrayal work that I do, where people feel like they are ostracized by their faith community. Friends get tired of people just not getting over it, minimizing. And this, as we're going to go through trauma, the things that makes it worse, that is absolutely one of those things. So Job, he had profound relational rupture, right? He didn't feel like he could trust anybody. The good thing is he's talking to God. And that is the difference between Job and what happens with a lot of people. Even though he's angry and he's questioning and he's hurt, he is still talking to God. So what is trauma? It's not just these big events that, a lot of times people think that trauma is only these big things. And we would call those big T traumas, like abuse, assault, accidents, war, neglect, and betrayal. But also there is what we would call small T traumas, like chronic criticism, emotional unavailability, humiliation, abandonment, bullying, betrayal in relationships. Now, I wouldn't even say anything chronic. I wouldn't even say, if it's chronically happened, it's not really a small T trauma because it is consistent over time. If this were an isolated event, we might say that is small T trauma, but anything that is ongoing, and the closer the person is to you in the relationship who betrays you, the more difficult the trauma is going to be. The brain doesn't rank pain. So whether it's a big T trauma or small T trauma, and this is in the eye of the beholder too. What someone might experience as a big T trauma, someone else might, say that it's a little T. So this is also something to keep in mind. We are all different in terms of our resiliency, our chemical makeup, our resources, our faith, our stature, our health. There are so many variations between people that it's really, you can't classify to say, this person had this little event and this person had this big event, because we are just so varied in our ability to deal with life, really. And it doesn't mean someone's weak if it's harder on them. The point is, though, any kind of trauma is going to change your nervous system and how you are able then to respond to life. And this happens on an unconscious level. Your central nervous system, you don't tell your heart to beat, it just does it. You don't tell your heart to speed up when you have a trigger, it's just doing it. So trauma isn't just what happened to you, it's more about what happened inside of you as a result. So we can also see David in the Bible when he is in mental anguish in throughout the Psalm, but I'm going to reference 13:1-2. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? So David, this part of Psalm, he experienced the betrayal from King Saul. He was in constant threat of death. It was family dysfunction. He was kind of crumbling beneath the weight of leadership. And he's just exhausted from this prolonged stress and hypervigilance. And I know a lot of people can relate to that. God's response to David, and this is important, he doesn't rebuke him for his raw honesty. Instead, the lament is preserved in scripture as a model for how to process trauma before God. Again, it's as long as we're talking to God, that means we're still in connection to him. If we shut him out and harden our hearts, then we're in trouble. And that's right where the enemy wants us to be. So the thing to realize about trauma is that it disrupts all three dimensions of love. So the commandment to love God. Trauma distorts our image of God. We will project our wounds onto him, seeing him as unsafe, absent, or disappointed in us. Of course, this isn't across the board. For some people will actually lean into God, depending on the trauma, depending on the circumstance, depending on a lot of factors. Again, can't cover all of that, but it is not uncommon that people who experience certain types of parenting dynamics, who grew up with a lot of religion and control or abuse at the hands of caregivers, feeling unprotected, a lot of times people will see God as very unloving, very unprotecting. Trauma absolutely disrupts our ability to love ourselves because it tells us that we're too much, we're not enough, we're fundamentally flawed. And self-compassion for people in trauma feels impossible. And that is one of the things that I'm really, working hard at when I'm working with people with trauma, is to start making space for self-compassion, because it will not happen on automatically. It is something we have to actually kind of step into and practice with the Lord's help. And then loving others just wreaks havoc on relationships. It activates our defense strategies. We have a whole lot of defense strategies. I'm going to do an episode on that, but essentially they're walls, people pleasing, getting enmeshed with unhealthy people, or withdrawing. But essentially, it's not real intimacy. Our motivations, if we have trauma and we've not healed and resolved the trauma, our motivations are not going to be where they need to be. And then we're going to get exhausted. We're going to get resentful. We're going to have problems connecting with other people or even feeling seen or valued by other people. So how trauma distorts our view of God. Again, this is not, for everybody, but for many, many, many people, when you have met people who say, I can't believe in God, I can't believe in a God who would allow these things, who would, not protect people, you've seen people be distorted in their view of God. And they themselves have had trauma. And living in this country with everything that is going on now, we can have what's called vicarious trauma. And I am going to be going over, again, that's going to be a several part episode, but we're experiencing trauma of just being in this world and seeing terrible things happen to other people, even if it's not happening to us. When people have trauma and it does distort their view of God, God will feel distant, unreliable, or unsafe. Prayer will feel futile or even dangerous. People believe that God is punishing them or has abandoned them. They perform for God instead of resting in him because they don't know God's heart. And the spiritual intimacy with God actually triggers fear of rejection. And that trauma, generally this kind of trauma in the way that it distorts view of God, is from complex trauma. And I'm going to break down the different kinds of trauma. So the path towards healing from a distorted view of God needs to be done very consistently in a very safe, therapeutic environment. That God's character is not shaped by your experience with humans. People are going to have a hard time believing that, but consistency and working out the lies and the trauma from their body is essential. And normalizing that lament is actually biblical. Trauma gives you permission to cry out. Healing the nervous system opens up our heart to God. And sometimes people need something like EMDR or brain spotting to reprocess these spiritual wounds because it is so deep. The part of our brain that uses logic is called the prefrontal cortex. That's 2 + 2 = 4. Where trauma is stored in our body is not in our logical brain. It is in the back of our brain. It affects our amygdala and our hippocampus and our thalamus and all of the parts of our brain that regulate our nervous system, our fight or flight system. And the only way for us to heal from trauma, if especially the complex trauma, is to be in a safe community and safe relationships that can re-mirror healthy God's love, not the man-made, enemy-inspired version of God. So trauma will tell a person that they are too broken to be loved, that their needs don't matter. There's chronic self-criticism and self-blame for all kinds of problems in life. It's like something happens and the immediate narrative is, oh, that's my fault. There's an inability to receive care or comfort from other people because they just don't feel like they deserve it. And self punishment is oftentimes a coping strategy. So there's a lot of self sabotage that goes on with trauma. And again, trauma is on a spectrum. Not everybody will have as severe or as challenging impact and how it shows up in their life as other people, but it's very, very sneaky, and how people don't realize what they're struggling with is actually from trauma, which is why I wanted to do this episode. So, what God says instead of the trauma that's telling us about ourselves, God says that you're fearfully and wonderfully made. Psalm 139:14. Compassion begins with how we treat ourselves. I need to start having compassion for myself. And then I can, start. And sometimes when I'm working with people, think about someone else in the same situation and then bring that into yourself, because this could go either way. Sometimes we think other people deserve good things, but not us. And so sometimes we have to get outside of ourselves to see compassion and to see that people were just doing the best they could at the time, and then bring that, compassion into their own hearts. But healing trauma allows grief to replace shame. Again, when there is trauma, there is grief, and people will get stuck in the cycle of grief if they are stuck in trauma. There needs to be grieving that has to take place that will help heal the trauma, and healing the trauma will make it possible to heal the grief. So kind of go in an inverse and reverse relationship to help us get this out of our body. But self-care is not selfish, it is stewardship. That is something that is so misunderstood, but I've already said enough about that in my former episodes. But you can't give away what you don't have. So if you don't love yourself deeply and fully in the way that God loves you, you're not going to be able to love other people from the abundance or from a kind of an unselfish or fear-based motivation. We have to love ourselves and receive the love of the Lord if we're going to have more of a capacity from a healthy motivation to love others. And then lastly, as far as how trauma impacts our ability to love others, is it blocks intimacy. This hyper vigilance, scanning for threat and safe relationships, it's like the alarm bell is always going off with somebody who has had trauma. And this could be more subtle if the trauma happened a long time ago or if it was complex trauma. But if it's more acute in the case of intimate betrayal, this hypervigilance, this is up and active. And it takes a long time for this to settle down. And generally, there's some things that people actively need to do to get this hypervigilance down. But people will build walls, which makes them emotionally unavailable and self-protective. Remember that, because we're going to be talking about the different states of the heart. Reactivity, there will be a disproportionate anger or withdrawal. So we say in my field, if you are hysterical, it's probably historical. Meaning, you can probably see somebody like, oh my gosh, you just dropped that thing. Like, why are you reacting this way? It's probably an over exaggerated sense of shame or failure or unprocessed emotion or grief. So there's other reasons for reactivity, but the point is that oftentimes people's reactivity sensors is because of unprocessed trauma. People pleasing at the expense of authenticity. Just looking at somebody who is in the pattern of people pleasing, they can look very kind. They can look like they just want to help. But the motivation behind people pleasing is almost like out of desperation. And the motivation is, I need to please you so that your needs are met, because if your needs are met, then I'm going to feel okay. Again, that's a different motivation than I feel whole. I'm okay with you having your emotions. I'm okay with mine. I can let you be you. And if you're in a bad mood, I can just say you're in a bad mood. That's not my problem to fix it. That might sound really unkind, but that is what boundaries are. People who have wounded attachment and trauma, they're very uncomfortable with people with negative emotions or anger around them. So that would be another telltale sign that there's something unprocessed there. And it also blocks intimacy, the experience of trauma, because again, we're reenacting old wounds in our new relationships. So this is a little too complex for me to break down any further than that, but there is definitely this pattern where We experience some of the same stuff from our earlier attachment figures and our current relationships, whether that's a fear of it happening or we're choosing people that are actually kind of like this self-fulfilling prophecy. These things actually occur in our current relationships. And this happens on an unconscious level. Nobody, consciously chooses to reenact their trauma. It just happens. And that's why we need to heal this stuff. The plan or the redemption, then the strategy for this, for moving toward connection instead of blocking intimacy, is secure attachment is possible in adulthood. We can work for this. We can heal our wounded attachment. We do not have to be stuck in this woundedness forever. We can work towards it. We can absolutely fight these lies. And we can also, I love this quote, you can't change the people around you, but you can change the people around you, right? You can you can't change the people around you, but you can change the people around you. We want to make sure we're putting healthy people around us because we cannot change people. So we want to choose people who are safe. So safe relationships actually rewire the nervous system, which is fascinating to observe and to be a participant of that. But setting limits is an act of love, not rejection. But people who have trauma that's unresolved, when people set limits with them, it feels like rejection. And so people who have struggled with attachment wounds and trauma and still are kind of in the middle of the effects of that, they will look at somebody who has boundaries and they will seem like they're very cold. They will seem like they're just not safe. And of course, we don't want to be cold. Boundaries aren't meant to be cold and shut everybody out, but we need to be able to modulate who we're letting in appropriate ways and who not. And some relationships are not, healthy or not appropriate for us to have certain connections with people. We need to be able to set limits where appropriate. And vulnerability to someone who experienced trauma, it requires a regulated nervous system, because somebody who has a dysregulated nervous system from the trauma, they will not be vulnerable because it's unsafe. Everything inside of their system is screaming red alert, red alert. And so connection with God's self and others actually feels like a threat. It actually feels dangerous, especially people who had significant childhood trauma. And our healing, again, does require change in our relationship with God, self, and others. We cannot stay doing the same thing and operating in the same ways as we're healing from trauma. Recovery by nature is about change. It's about improvement. It's about progress, not perfection. So the thing about trauma too is it almost always, I don't even think almost, it always comes with shame. To understand shame, you have to know that it comes from trauma. But we're going to pick up on the next episode on shame and breaking that down, and then continuing to talk about trauma and the body.